Thank you for coming here. Thank you for your time. And hopefully this will be a valuable session. I will talk about some threats in the cloud that we have detected as a company. Not only actually what we do, but basically how crooks, how criminals have learned to exploit the cloud for their malicious operations for multiple purposes that can range from, I don't know, cryptojacking or simply new ways to evade traditional security solutions and so on. I would say that today is pretty easy to find some examples every day. I mean, I just did a test yesterday. I went on Google just to type some breach, simply breach in the cloud, and basically the latest one, quite big, happened no later than 9 days ago. But every day there's something new. There are operations carried out through the cloud. There are high-profile victims. You probably remember that one of the companies, which is the symbol of this digital transformation process, which is Tesla, was compromised more or less 1 year ago. Unfortunately, in that case, the consequences were not so serious, but that's an example of the implications that may occur when, for instance, cloud services are misconfigured and so on. Which are the attacks that can be carried out through cloud resources? We have, for example, malware infection through cloud. We will see a slide after, but we have called this phenomenon the cloud fan-out effect. Basically, what happens is that the synchronization of documents in the cloud may augment the possibility of the malware to spread, to propagate. Cloud resources can be used for storing the malicious payload or storing the command and control. There's a very simple logic behind this that tends to evade the physical firewalls, the physical security, the security technologies, but in the same time, then to evade the human firewall. Because if I see a connection that is going to a service that for me is benign, that I recognize like a Google Drive or can be whatever, as we will see soon, obviously I feel more comfortable that I'm not a victim of a threat. And of course, the next point, using the cloud to hide phishing is similar. We'll see some examples of real-world events that we detected and headed to the news. Of course, application vulnerabilities can be exploited to run attacks, or maybe even not only to run attacks. If you believe that many services like the DNS, for examples, can be managed directly from a cloud service, from an IaaS platform, you can understand even in this case the consequences. Brute forcing weak passwords, and you know, this is becoming quite dramatic because you are probably aware of the dumps that come out on a really weekly basis. The latest one was probably less than 10 days ago, additional 92 million accounts. And obviously, I can simply do credential stuffing attacks or just try to enter. Maybe I leverage, I hope that people are not security savvy, they don't change their passwords, and I can start to scan public facing services. Okay? And unfortunately, the material, there's even too much material with all these breaches. And obviously, the last one is related directly, hunting for publicly accessible IaaS resources like S3 buckets. Again, just go on your favorite search engine and type S3 buckets leak, and you can see you will spoil for the choice, because there are multiple examples on a really, really daily basis. So, as I said before, cloud services are increasingly increasingly used to host the command and controls and to distribute malware. We call this new trend hybrid threats, because basically they use traditional infection vectors like the web or like a phishing email. But at a certain point of the attack stage, they decide to put some elements in the cloud. Basically, the distribution of the payload, for example, or also the command and control. And we will see later the reason why this is done. So malware infects the device via via an traditional initial vector like a drive-by campaign, a phishing email. When the malware is downloaded, it calls various services like websites, cloud storage, etc., and then basically can use the cloud storage also to exfiltrate the information. So basically, you know the kill chain. So recognition, weaponization, delivery of the payload, exploit, and also callback and persist. You know probably that basically the kill chain may vary. The times of the kill chain and the phases of the kill chain may vary depending if the attack is opportunistic or targeted. But it's interesting actually because we have noticed, not only us, of course, there are multiple examples of attacks carried out using the kill chain modified to cope with the cloud, both opportunistic in nature and targeted. I remember at least 2 examples, very recent examples of targeted attacks exploiting the cloud by an APT called Dark Hydrus, targeting primarily the Middle East, and another IPT called the Cobalt Strike Gang. The guys behind also the Carbanak malware. You are probably aware of the Carbanak malware, so targeting primarily financial organizations. And the cloud can be used, you know, basically the recognition is normally done when the attack is targeted because I need to collect information about my victims. Normally, the most used channel is social engineering because unfortunately today you can go on a social network and you can see every single detail of the life of a person, and unfortunately the line between personal and professional life, even on personal social networks, is very blurred. But also, even the cloud can be used because I have multiple ways to recognize if a specific application if a specific target is using a cloud service, because I can try to guess the domains and see if these domains exist, and then try to use stolen credentials to see if I can enter. Then, the delivery, obviously, traditionally has always been using the web or also the email, but today, as we will see, can also use the cloud. The exploit, again, can use the cloud because actually, yeah, the exploit happens in the endpoint, but there might be multiple stages where multiple stages of the payload are downloaded, and obviously then the callback and persist, the callback phase. Obviously, the persistence phase happens only if the attack is targeted, normally because the attackers want to establish the footprint inside the organization and then use this footprint to do their nasty things. There has been a very remarkable example recently, just a couple of weeks ago, of a company in our sector that was victim of similar attacks. But anyway, the callback, even in this case, can go to a command and control infrastructure hosted on a cloud service. Why is the cloud used for this, these phases of the kill chain for multiple reasons. First, if I decide to go in an infrastructure like, for example, AWS, it's everywhere. I don't need to explicitly register a domain, so expose an element of the attack chain that can be detected or blacklisted. Most of all, every organization now, directly or indirectly, is using AWS. And so basically, these domains will never be blacklisted. And in the same time, on-prem technologies don't do decryption on a large scale, obviously, because it affects performances, it affects the user experience, and so on. So basically, it's very likely that if a certain organization is using Google, is using AWS, is using Google Cloud Platform, there will be very lax security controls on the traffic going to these cloud services. So if it's a callback, won't be detected, won't be blacklisted, most of all. And if it's a payload distribution, obviously that connection won't be scanned, because normally traditional firewalls or proxies don't scan these domains because don't have resources for SSL decryption on a large scale, because they introduce latency and so on. Unfortunately, the criminals have quickly understood this reality and obviously are adapting to that. Okay. Once that we have just described how the threat, the kill chain has evolved, or basically how the cloud can play some roles inside the kill chain. Let's see some examples. I've told you before the risks connected to the adoption of the threats connected to the adoption of the cloud. But for example, this was a research that my company did. Basically, back in September 2016, we discovered a malware called Virlux, virus locker, that was characterized by having basically two functions on the heat file. The file was encrypted, obviously, and in the same time was turned into an infector. What happened, we discovered this threat because basically the file infected a cloud application, a cloud storage, and so all the files became infection vectors, and obviously they were synchronized inside the company, and obviously the malware was able to propagate much more quickly. We believed that this was only a theoretical effect. We call this the fan-out effect, but in the same time, a couple of years, 1.5 years after, there was another ransomware using a similar mechanism called QKG that was using, basically, he was propagating himself through basically the document template. So he infected the files, infecting the template, and so all the documents written with the same template were infected as well. And obviously imagine what happens if I'm using Office 365, if my organization is using Office 365, for example, and the documents will be put at disposal of all the members of the organization and synchronized. But this is the first example. We discovered it back in 2016. We believed it was only a theoretical effect, but there are also some examples in the wild using similar techniques to propagate. Just for the records, this is every more or less 6 months, my company publishes a report of the malware that we see, and basically, except for in the cloud, obviously in the cloud. This is the telemetry that we collect from the customer base in the cloud, and normally we see that backdoors and Microsoft Office macros rank at #1. I'm curious to see what will be the outcome in the next report. This one was the latest because we do one every 6 months. This was more or less 1 year ago. The latest one in October was dedicated to the IaaS security, but I think it's nearly time for the 2019 report. So I'm curious to see what will be the outcomes. So this is just to tell you that basically these are, the cloud services are used in the kill chain because they are able to bypass traditional security measures. It's like a Lambo that is able to pass the parking bar. Okay. Unfortunately, I didn't find a picture with a real Italian car. I know Lambo is Italian, but just the name, given that it belongs to the VAG group. But anyway, this was a very good example to show you basically how it is possible to evade a security, the traditional security. Let's see some examples, actually. These are examples that we spotted in the wild. Actually, many of them, I was unsure if showing these slides because actually, you know CoinHive. You know what CoinHive is, right? It's a library to mine. It's a library to mine Monero. Many of these examples actually were using CoinHive that has been shut down 2 weeks ago because now the price of the crypto coins is so volatile that actually they said, we don't think that our project is convenient any longer. Anyway, the examples that we spotted were primarily related to miners that are currently probably the main threats in this in 2018, in the second part of 2018 and this beginning of 2019. In any case, this is the typical example of an hybrid threat. Because basically, in this case, the initial payload was delivered via, we discovered 2 different variants of the same campaign, basically using a drive-by, okay, or a pay-per-install or executable. But basically the purpose of the executable was just to install the dropper and basically download the miner from AWS. And also, once the machine was compromised, the details were exfiltrated to another AWS instance. This is exactly the application of the attack modus operandi that I explained before. AWS normally is open. Also because when I visit a website or when I visit an application that has nothing to deal in theory with AWS, this application can go to fetch some content from AWS where I will be redirected. And so if I have a firewall, a next generation firewall, if I have a next generation technology, this technology will see that there's a connection to AWS, but won't be able to recognize the context of the connection. If I'm going to the specific instance of AWS belonging to my organization, or if I'm going to an anonymous AWS instance that is containing malware, for example, or simply to an anonymous instance of AWS where I'm exfiltrating data. Okay? And the criminals, unfortunately, have learned this much faster than many security companies and use ways like this to drop the malicious payload and exfiltrate the content. And in this particular campaign, the criminals were able to earn $100,000 in illicit mining in the space of 2 weeks, more or less. This was another example, Zminer, but a very similar modus operandi. In this case, the initial attack vector was an exploit kit, and the executable downloaded the payloads from an S3 storage, and obviously, again, mining and exfiltration of data to AWS. Another example of the same kill chain that we have seen before, but again, using the cloud. Okay? This one was even more interesting because it used let's say, multiple factors. And this is, so the difference is that the previous two campaigns we have seen were opportunistic. This one, instead, is an example of a targeted campaign by the Cobalt strike gang. Was discovered quite recently because it was, I think it was January this year. January, February, quite recently. And basically, in this case, the redirection to the malicious site happened through a redirection on Google Cloud Platform application engine. You know that Google Cloud Platform has this, it's a feature they have, it's called Open Redirector. Okay, when I go to a domain, in this specific case, basically, the attack started with a PDF decoy. The user clicked on the PDF file. Normally, the PDF viewer show you that, okay, this document is connecting to an external source. And this was the case as well, obviously. But this external source was Google Cloud Platform. And so the user thinks, okay, it's connecting to Google Cloud Platform. It's not connecting to blah, 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 the Z, X, Y, blah, blah, dot something. So it's a trusted document. In this case, obviously, the attackers were evading the human firewall, the human security. But then, when connecting to that URL, it was a logout URL with a redirection, an HTTP 302 redirection to the real malware distribution site. So it's a chain of factor, obviously. But again, the connection is going to Google Cloud Platform. So maybe it's not inspected. There's nothing bad on that for the technology, but also for the user. Because, as I said before, Google application engine, the domain was applicationengine.google.com. It's a Google domain. It's nothing malicious. And by the way, this is a by design feature. Unfortunately, Google say, I don't have any responsibility where the redirection happens. We are improving, obviously, to make sure that we can check these domains, but the open redirection, it's a feature that is part of our suite. But that's an example of how the cloud can be leveraged to evade human and technological security. Things can only get better or not. This is another example, obviously capital install hosted on and served via IIS. This was another example of a targeted attack. This was Dark Hydrus using Google Drive, Dark Hydrus and APT targeting entities in the Middle East, using Google Drive for, let's say, its command and control. Okay. This was another research that basically Google Sheets can spread CSV malware. It's a similar approach to the previous one we have seen. In this case, basically, when I download the document from Google Drive and I execute the document, obviously, Microsoft will warn you that there's a macro that is doing something. But you say, oh, this document was downloaded from Google Sheet. So it's okay, it's good. So, you can notice that there is always a common denominator in the utilization of the cloud services to launch this kind of attacks. And is always the possibility to combine the human insecurity with basically the lack or the human trust with the lack of controls on cloud services that many entities, many organizations have. So, human factors and technological factors. Then, okay. Do you remember this movie? No, you are too young, maybe. Come on, guys. Yes, exactly. The Naked Gun. You are too young, unfortunately. But, you know, there was this guy with basically this factory that was exploding and people screaming everywhere, and he was saying, nothing here, please disperse. And obviously it's what is happening, because basically there are multiple ways where the cloud can be exploited for attacks, but unfortunately it seems there's not much awareness at the moment, despite all the news that we see each day on a daily and weekly basis. Anyway, other way to use the cloud to launch attacks. This is slightly different, but there are already multiple examples. In this way, the phishing page was hosted on Azure. And the reason is very simple. Because the certificate is signed by Microsoft. You know that the certificate of the phishing page. Obviously, the first level of mistrust is always the human being, and when you see, in theory, you should be concerned when you see the browser telling you, you know, you are going to this domain, but I don't recognize this domain. Or maybe you are going to a domain with a strange name. In this case, the phishing page was hosted into an Azure blob. And so the certificate was signed by Microsoft. Completely legitimate, and also with a domain name which sounded kind of familiar for the victims. So again, I don't need to register any specific domain on the web. I can use an infrastructure that provides me with resiliency, of course, availability, because this is another problem for the attackers. They must make sure that their infrastructures are available, resilient, and so on. And so it's even better. Why not storing a malicious page on Azure? There have been actually, yes. This hasn't been the only case, actually, because there has been also another similar campaign, similar at least in concept, in the wild, called the Fishpoint, where basically the phishing campaign was triggered through a SharePoint document received. Again, in this case, the users believe they are using a legitimate cloud application, and obviously there's the same common denominator we have seen before. The company that discovered Fishpoint believes that the 10% of the Office 365 organizations, customers worldwide, have been affected. Maybe it's too much in my humble opinion, but it's another interesting evidence of how the traditional attacks like phishing can find new dimensions thanks to the cloud. Okay? But in the same time, cloud is not only SaaS, software as a service. Cloud is also, it's actually increasingly IaaS, infrastructure as a service. So basically, I can have my services like AWS, Azure, Google Cloud Platform, and start to build my applications, to host my services, and so on. And of course, I can leave open ports on these, open doors, actually, in these services. This is an example, actually. It happened to me. It's not very recent, but I want to use it as well, because actually what was quite impressive for me, honestly. But basically, I was playing, it was May last year, I believe. I was playing with, it was not a honeypot, or it was not voluntarily a honeypot. I was just doing some tests. I was playing with a Linux server on AWS. I had this, I think it was the Python embedded web server, Flask, okay, in debug mode, because I was just writing a simple client-server thing. I started to see connections coming from nowhere, and these connections came out just after probably, 10 minutes. Okay? Now, imagine if I simply open up and I spin up a virtual machine, I publish a web server, and basically I don't care of the security. Or maybe, actually, in this case, the attackers were looking for, I think this was the first, it was Drupalgeddon 2. You are familiar probably with the Drupalgeddon. Drupal is a content management server. And every more or less 3 months, there's a serious vulnerability. And criminals try to exploit it to normally install cryptojackers. In this case, they were scanning for vulnerable Drupal servers, this was different because it was a home router, or basically in the third case, they were trying to guess the JBoss version to exploit to probably exploit CVE 2017, etc. But after 10 minutes, someone was knocking, something actually, because it was probably a bot, was knocking at my door to see, is there any vulnerability that I can exploit for any purposes? So imagine, what does this mean basically today to have a cloud applications or a cloud application on these services which is not patched? Because the problem is that now, okay, the criminals don't simply compromise the application. They can enter, if it's unsecured, and move horizontally and compromise other services used from the same organization. There was an example, I don't remember, but basically, yes, do you know my Ether wallet? My Ether wallet basically was compromised. I think it was October. And the attackers, the attack point for the attackers was the DNS of the company that was stored on AWS, was root 53. It was not secured enough. The attackers were able to enter, change the records, and hijack the traffic. So we are bringing everything in the cloud, not only the data of our organization, of the organizations, but also the services. So the implications, the consequences of a compromise can basically spread in multiple sectors. From the data to the DNS configuration can impact the organization itself, can impact also the supply chain, the partners, the ecosystem, and so on. So, yeah, this is an example. As I said before, cryptojacking was basically, let's say that CoinHive has been among the protagonists of this 2018 and 2019 InfoSec here, but the problem is that the price of the cryptocurrencies is becoming more and more volatile, and basically the guys behind the CoinHive have decided to abandon the project. So now, having resources to exploit in order to mine is becoming more and more important, and obviously these resources are in the cloud. The size of, let's say, the possible victims of a cryptojacking attack through, for instance, something like CoinHive must be very high in order to make the attack profitable. But if I'm able to go to the cloud, to compromise resources in the cloud where I can have much more processing power without obviously paying the bill, that's much more interesting for the attackers. And that's the reason why, obviously, they are looking at IaaS resources in order to basically launch these kind of attacks. And these are the consequences. Yes, that's the example of my Ether wallet, where basically, no, actually it was April 2018. My memory is fading, unfortunately. But obviously, there was recently a report by AT&T, and basically cryptojacking of businesses' cloud resources still going strong. And behind this, there's always misconfiguration, lack of visibility, and so on. If I have a misconfigured server, basically, it's not only now, possibly billion of people on the internet can take advantage of that. And these are the consequences. So that's what happens, basically. Cryptocurrency miners are installed in corporate environments, and point scanners will miss the file, or basically flag the file as potentially unwanted applications. But yeah, basically, it's important to be able to compromise as many resources as possible in the cloud, because that's where the processing power is and can make these kind of attacks profitable, given the fluctuations of the value of the cryptocurrencies. This was another example. As I said before, this is probably not so recent anymore, but we found everything in cloud storage. You know how CoinHive works. Basically, it's a JavaScript library, so I can run it from everywhere. And when the CoinHive frenzy was high, we were able to detect basically a guy in a certain organization. This guy had just copied a static page inside its OneDrive organization account. Unfortunately, this static page was compromised with CoinHive, or actually was CoinHive had been injected, and basically it was just a static help page. But every people of the same organization visiting this page was illicitly mining cryptocurrencies, because the page was infected, had been injected with CoinHive. And this is another example of the implications that may occur when basically, because the cloud can propagate the malware, the nasty things much quicker. As I said before, it's funny now, CoinHive has been discontinued because it's not profitable anymore. So I'm curious to see what the crooks will invent. Maybe they will try to compromise even more cloud resources to have more processing power. This is another example, but okay, brute forcing weak password for public facing servers. That's the way when the initial attack to Tesla happened, because basically they had a Kubernetes anonymous instance. And so the attackers were able to enter. They were scanning. Okay, let's just try and see. But, and you know, there are so many statistics on the weaknesses of passwords that, again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. And today, basically, trying these passwords in cloud services, it's nearly for free. There are so many tools, so many ways to do it. But obviously, again, the consequences can be very bitter for an organization. If I have my data on Office 365 and my company that doesn't have multi-factor authentication or a proper password policy, obviously it's very simple to scan to basically, if I want to target a certain organization, I can see if this organization has Office 365, I can guess the domains, I can guess the emails, and I can run similar attacks on Office, on AWS, etc. And the problem is that basically, if I have a misconfigured password today, it's not like having it in the post-it note where only the people in my office can see it. It's just like having it on a post-it note that is visible by the whole internet. The problem is that, of course, it's not only the technology. The problem is that people are facing the cloud, but I like to say that too many of them have still a mindset an on-prem mindset. They are using the cloud, but they believe that, okay, I can have the password 13456 and I can stick my password in the monitor through a post-it. It's not like this anymore, unfortunately. You shouldn't do it. You should not do it in your post-it, in your monitor, obviously, but absolutely you haven't to do it with cloud applications, because potentially everybody can use this weakness to break into. And these are some examples, basically. I mean, misconfigured S3, I don't remember where I did it, but AWS employee Flab exposes S3 bucket containing GoDaddy server. GoDaddy, 4 million Time Warner cable records. This one happened, misconfigured boss accounts lead to sensitive data leaks. This one happened 9 days ago. I just wanted to see an update and just went. Of course, it also headed to the news, but you can see that this kind of attacks, this kind of breaches are very, very frequent. And here, of course, the technology can help to enforce stronger passwords, but of course, it's up to the users to make sure that, I mean, I must have proper policies, I must have proper technologies to enforce the policies, but obviously even the users must be savvier. So, I think it's 45 minutes. Oh, I'm perfect. It's 12:14. I'm impressed by myself. So, takeaways. As the usage of cloud services increased, the kill chain has evolved and it's now leveraging cloud resources in multiple stages of the attacks, as we have seen for the cloud, the role of cloud services in the kill chain. Cloud services are useful for targeted and opportunistic operations, for delivering malware, hosting command and control infrastructure, hosting phishing pages. They can be the keys of the kingdom, but also so people can enter and steal data, but also abused for other purposes. And obviously, proper processes and technologies must be in place. Also the processes, because it's useless, to spend money for cloud technologies if the user's mindset is on-prem. And also, of course, if I have a certain security policy, if I have a certain security level, I must make sure that also my supply chain is compliant with that. Because obviously, if I have a weak element in my supply chain, this weak element will be exploited and will vanish all the money and all the money I've spent, all the technologies I have in place. And there have been multiple examples of attacks carried out through cloud applications via a weak supply chain. For example, you maybe remember all this thing that happened with the Mage card when they compromised an artificial intelligence company, and obviously all the customers, all the entities customers of this company were compromised. Actually, was a chatbot, a company providing chatbot services to multiple customers. It was compromised, and obviously all the customers were consequently compromised. And I believe, and this is even actually more important from the cloud, because of the cloud, since maybe I'm getting the service from someone else and I have no idea what is happening on the other side where I take the service from. And that was all from my side. And thank you for your time. Thank you for attending this presentation. And obviously, if you have questions, I'm here.
Thank you, Paolo. Any questions? You all hungry? No questions?
Okay,
well, then I guess,
By the way, we have a booth, actually. So if you have other maybe if any questions come to your mind in the meantime, you know how to reach us. Thank you again.
Thanks.